Darling, so thank you for being here. My guest today is Leslie Wilkin, psychotherapist and registered clinical counselor. She holds a master's degree in clinical social work and has worked for the last 16 years in the areas of relational trauma, gender-based violence, and women's mental health. Her private practice, Wild Hawthorne Homestead and Therapy, is located on a 5-acre sanctuary on Gabrielle Island. In addition to her clinical training, Leslie draws much of her inspiration and learning from the cycles of the natural world, non-human allies, wise women archetypes, and eco-feminist values. So I'm so thrilled that you agreed to join me in this conversation. Sorry, I was supposed to come, see your beautiful place, but my car had other plans for me. So unfortunately, still fortunately that we can do it over Zoom thanks to technology.
No, it's all good. I'm happy we're able to have this conversation one way or another.
Yeah, so 16 years is a long time. How has that practice and all those years brought you to where you are now, and maybe you can describe your practice now?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first entered the field, I was working almost exclusively in programs with women who had experienced violence, often women who were very marginalized on multiple markers of power and well-being, and interconnected with a lot of systems, and that was very intense work. That was very meaningful work that was tied very much to my values. I don't think I understood the magnitude of the impact of trauma that I was seeing. So I got very interested in learning deeply about trauma physiology and neurobiology, about the social and spiritual dimensions of trauma, about trauma treatment and recovery, and the clinical and non-clinical paths to trauma recovery. And so continued to work in that capacity. I worked in addictions and with youth, and always trauma being the focal point. And for about the last 4.5 years, I've been in private practice, working again almost exclusively with women who have experienced trauma, often the types of trauma that women are more often subjected to: interpersonal, intimate partner violence, childhood sexual abuse, sexual assault. And what I have learned is, there's the understanding of trauma, and then there is the experience of relationship that it happens in, right? And the impact on sense of self and the capacity to be in relationship, which can often be the harder parts to treat. And those early templates of relationship that we bring in. So even if there hasn't been trauma, if there's been insecure attachment or, not enough relational stability or security, we can hold these models in ourselves that actually really, really interrupt the system's attempts to heal, right? And this is where we start to see things like chronic shame and the way that shame interfaces with trauma. That's certainly a big area of my practice. And as I got to understand shame and the way chronic shame functions, I had to understand anger too. I had to understand anger as something often that was wanting to happen but couldn't happen. Right? Something, a protective energy that was wanting to happen to defend the self, to defend dignity, to defend autonomy, and couldn't happen. And a really complicated relationship with anger. Anger often that wanted to be expressed but couldn't be expressed, or feelings of anger that were kind of keeping the system out of collapsing into a shame state, right? So it's all connected in some way, but really what I've come to focus on at this stage of my practice is, what is the relational legacy of whatever the trauma is? How does that play out with us in the relationship, in the here and now? How does that play out in your relationships out in the world? Because we need safe connection to recover from trauma. And if we have things inside us that are interrupting that, often for good reason, but are interrupting that, it does make the recovery process really just more complicated and more complex. So.
From the intro, there's a few pieces and what you were just mentioning that I'd like to touch on.
Yeah.
The spiritual component of your practice, as well as wise women archetypes, eco-feminist values. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that is also coming from this place of, how do we heal? We don't just heal in this very Western kind of linear top-down cognitive therapy and medication. And there's these robust ways of bringing rhythm and bringing connection back into the system that, I would say have existed in indigenous cultures throughout the world in various ways of knowing, ways of finding rhythm and resonance. Again, I think often what I'll see with people, as I said, most of the type of trauma I work with is relationship. In that not only does it happen in relationship, it also happens in relationship with people you're supposed to be able to love and trust, or people you're supposed to be able to depend on. And so there can be a lot of complexity around relying on humans again. There can be a lot of complexity around, I know I need connection, and yet humans make me feel like I'm too much, or I'm not enough, or they hurt me, or they let me down. And so often it can be like, okay, and what about the non-human world? What about the ancestral world? What about all these other layers of connection that you might be able to feel some trust and reliability and resonance with, if humans are still feeling a bit too complicated? So that's very deeply embedded in my practice. Nature as a resource for bringing some safety and some soothing into the body, and nature as a template for, like, how do I feel safe in connection again?
That's so beautiful. And that's, like, even from my own experience, that connection to nature, when I discovered it and feeling like, I remember for a while in my own healing, thinking like of the idea of like the trees and nature supporting and holding me was so comforting in a way that, wasn't available. So it's great to hear you talk about that. And part of what I want to do in my own, work, and what I want to bring to women is that extra layer of support and feeling through spiritual or creative practice. So I think that's incredible. Thank you. So in understanding the landscape with anger, we'll move on to that. So how does societal conditioning influence women's expression and perception of anger? And are there specific cultural or historical factors that shape these dynamics?
Well, maybe let me talk a little bit about anger just as a universal experience, and then we can talk about like where things kind of go sideways.
Absolutely.
Right. So, anger, I sort of want to break anger and then kind of healthy aggression into two connected but separate concepts, right? So anger being an emotion, I would suggest a primary emotion, an emotion that we're all born with, that we're all capable of experiencing. It emerges in response to a threat, to violation. It's meant to mobilize us to safety, right? And then healthy aggression really being, what are the actions that I need to take to be safe enough? What are the protective actions that I need to take? And I keep doing this with my hands because I really imagine it being like, what do I actually need to do to create safety and space here? So when we have access to this is, and we don't just see this in humans, we see this in mammals, right? Like mammals they might not have the emotion of anger, but they have these, my system feels threatened. I have these behaviors, I have these cues, I have these ways of responding meant to reestablish some protective safety into the system, right? So I think where it gets complicated is when those instincts are not able to be expressed when they need to be expressed. And that can be certainly in trauma. That can be because healthy aggression wasn't effective, or there was a sense it wasn't going to be effective. We can imagine too that children are very small and dependent. So often their attempts to use that cannot be effective either, right? So there's these layers. And then I think it gets compounded too with this messaging around, is it okay that you express that in your system? And I think we have a rhetoric around who is and who is not allowed to express healthy aggression. Because I don't know about you, but I feel like there's something that happens with, like, I want to say around puberty with girls, often like 12, 13, 14, where there's this like rage that moves through them. I don't know if that was your experience. That was definitely my experience. And when I worked in adolescent mental health, that was like a very real thing, because it's almost like this consciousness comes online that's like, okay, I'm a little bit bigger. I'm now seeing that, there's a lot of injustice and unfairness, either in my family system or in my, in the culture, or things that are upsetting me. And it comes through. And rather than meet girls in that and be like, okay, you're feeling this, it's real. It's a little unsophisticated because you're kind of immature. It's coming out like a little sideways. Let's help you cultivate that. Like, let's help you build a relationship with that so you can use it effectively. Instead, it's often met with shame. It's often stigmatized. It's pathologized. it's met with shame. We can trace this lineage back to, I don't even know how far back in sort of like the Victorian tradition we want to go around these ideas about girls and women being accommodating, being caregiving, being gentle, being really cognizant of making others feel good. Right. And so, there's this conditioning colliding with this very real emerging anger. And we often, when this could be building momentum and growing into this really protective energy in girls, is often when it actually gets shamed and buried and, flipped around. So I think that that's certainly a force that happens. Right. And I think we have to remember that we have to have access to some anger and aggression to have access to power, right? Like if we don't, I'm not suggesting we have to go around using it all the time, but we have to know that we have access to that in us. And so if we cut off access to that for an entire group of people, it really does maintain an imbalance of power, I think, in a bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially in the upbringing, I certainly recall, hitting puberty and I was labeled moody and like, oh, she's in a mood. And it was very much either like dismissed or shamed or, medicated for sure as well.
Yeah.
And whereas with boys, it's not the same, like that is a power and a sort of an action based, like powerful emotion for men. And then I guess that would translate out into, society and how women are sort of, our anger is put into like irritation and being annoyed and
right,
very much diminished.
Right. Absolutely. Well, you think about some of the ways that healthy aggression gets expressed, it's often like through a high level of physicality or through like using voice. And these are things when boys are being highly physical or like loud or using voice, we sort of just normalize that behavior. We don't really raise an eyebrow to it in quite the same way, and yet for girls, there's this complicating experience of I want to use my physicality. And then I actually feel like there's shame, and shame has this, recoil effect, this collapse of the self, right? There's something about me that, that's too much or that's not enough or, and starts to shut this down. And you're right. And then this anger that can maybe be felt but not expressed becomes much more complicated. And it doesn't have these avenues to come out to. Or what we see is even further down the continuum is women and girls get really skillful at just dissociating the emotion of anger out of consciousness altogether. It's like before it can even break into my awareness, I have these ways of like flipping it into something that's more acceptable to others, that's more digestible.
Yeah, I was starting to listen to yesterday, what is it called? Rage Becomes Her, I think the book is called. And it was talking about that, how women will often change anger into sadness and that it will like be, so then it is more acceptable and more sort of dismissive or I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, and then it can look like anxiety or depression instead of anger, because that's not an emotion that women are typically allowed to have.
Right. Right. And you see in that when we actually take away that protective function, then we create this collapse of the self, right? Like if there's a threat coming in and I feel like I can at least push back against it a bit, there's more energy in the self. If it's like I'm not allowed to push back, then there's no wall keeping shame and, devastation and overwhelm out. It just floods into the system, right? So then when we look at things like depression, we look at things like chronic shame, this experience of not having power and not being able to trust the sense of self in the world, and then deferring to others, or, not trusting your emotions or your decisions, or all these things that we hear women really struggle with.
Yeah, especially as you're coming up to learn your emotions through adolescence and everything, to just be met with all of that, it's definitely hard to become a strong woman at the end of that road. And then, you have to do all this work to sort of unlearn all that. Yeah. So how can we sort of challenge these stereotypes and create space for authentic emotional expression without judgment?
Well, I think part of it is having conversations like this, where it's like we take this out of the shadows and we bring it into the light, where it's like, yeah, most women that I know are angry. right? About something, right? It's like, and if you say like, I'm not angry, I would be like, okay. So either you have like really deeply secure attachment, you've created a lot of very deep safety in your home, in your work, in your relational world, you have a lot of capacity to be with emotion, or, or you found ways to dissociate it of consciousness. But most of us have a little anger, right? Like, most of us are living with that. So I think to name it and to normalize it. And I would say, I think the reality is, we can talk about living in a patriarchal society, but women also uphold the values of patriarchy with each other. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can look at the ways that we meet that energy in other women, right? Is like, does a woman who's vocal trigger something in us where it's like, I'm not allowed to do that, so she shouldn't be allowed to do that either. So I want to use a bit of shame to shut that down in her, right? We have to actually start to be conscious about the ways that we are complicit in this as well. And to start to encourage using voice, like to start to encourage, in our communities, in our groups of women, it's like, can we move through conflict without fawning or avoiding, right? Can we practice staying in the discomfort of feeling each other, like have a little resistance and use a little voice and, and express preference and disagreement and limits with each other? I think, that can be a really important place that we start to renegotiate. I guess I would also say it's like, if you have young women in your life who are going through that junction of like, that surge of awareness, is like, we might unconsciously project what we were told onto that chapter of life, right? Not purposely, not because we want to shut her down. It's just often that comes through without us realizing it. And so is there a way to say like, hey, yeah, this is there's some immaturity here. It's a little messy, but like, how do I help you cultivate a relationship with this like life force and this vitality in you, right? And if I don't know how to do that, what if we learn together, right? Like, what if we both learn to do that? So those are certainly some ways I would imagine that we challenge that. When I'm working with clients, one of the things I'll often bring into is I'll bring in reminders from the non-human world of how aggression shows up. Because often we have this shame around like, my anger is like messy and too much. But it's like, well, what about a tiger? What about right? Like, what about a grizzly bear? Like, we don't see that with shame. We just see that as instinct. We just see that as a really reasonable instinct that emerges in response to very specific stimuli. Right. And so sometimes expanding this into like our animal body, can also help shift some of the shame on it.
Wow. That's really interesting about how we uphold patriarchy as well. I'm going to have to sit with that one. But it is interesting, like how it does, when somebody is standing in their power and their voice, it will trigger other people. And I think even with adolescent women, I know, I have a teenage niece and that it can be messy,
Yeah.
and you do sort of have an instinct to just like, just put that in a box because I don't want to deal with it, sort of thing. But I've often thought, like with sharing with women and doing meditation circles and things, that, an adolescent women would need that so much. We often do it for women our age. We'll be sitting in circle or sharing or doing that sort of thing. But, to be able to come and support women just coming up through that, maybe we could, ease some of that shame and stop some of it to help them learn how to like access that power and befriend that power and all those emotions rather than, having that shame sort of flood in.
Absolutely. And I would love to see, I mean, if you're talking about sort of circles with adolescent women, which I think is great. It's like this, feminists were talking about this back in the 70s, is consciousness raising. It's like when we suddenly come together and we all name that we're having the same experience, and we kind of can't deny that it's happening anymore. And we kind of, the collective experience then sort of also alleviates some of the shame around it, right? But what I was going to say is I would love, when you talk about meditation circles, is I would love to see a wellness culture that allows anger to exist.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see, because I think the wellness culture has had a very complicated relationship with anger as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think about some of my own experiences, you know, in my 20s, finding yoga and meditation, and really understanding that anger was like, you know, a negative sort of unevolved emotion, that when it emerged in me, I was supposed to use all these techniques I was learning to like transform it into something else. Right. And I think, you know, we can run the risk of, you know, if we dissociated it in childhood and now we just bypass it in adulthood, that we haven't actually built a healthy relationship with it. And so can the wellness culture create space to see healthy aggression as a really valuable way that we navigate safety, and we navigate dignity, and we navigate boundaries, and we get to be active participants in defining the terms of relationship, like all the ways of conceptualizing this that we don't talk about, right? When we label it as like a bad or messy emotion.
Yeah, that's been my experience my whole life for sure. Like my astrologer friend would tell you, like I should really just be sitting on a mountain meditating all the time because of my chart. So my emotions are very big and very full body and very intense. And my whole life has just been sort of told like, that's too much. You need to put that away. And then even going through meditation training, you know, like we're just supposed to observe them and let them pass by. And I'm like, but this is consuming my entire being and I'm not supposed to engage with it. So it is that sort of challenge of, so I'm just supposed to get rid of it? Like, where is it supposed to go? You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And as I hear that the repair that needs to happen is not for you to figure out how to manage your big emotions. It's something that needs to happen in relationship that says, hey, Tasha, you came to believe that you were too much, but like, what if that was never actually true? Like that there's a relational repair that actually needs to happen in terms of your ability to understand your emotions, not that you need to fix it, right? It's like that you got a message somewhere along the line that, you know, that needs to be repaired.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm learning now, you know, into my 40s that it is, like a gift. Like it's very much an indicator for me that either something is not right and I need to change it, you know, and take action outwards in the world rather than just going like inward and trying to resolve it myself.
Absolutely. And to rebuild a relationship with your instincts, right? It's very powerful. You know, how do we have safety if we don't have instinct? How do we have safety if we're not allowed to access and trust our instincts?
Yes. And I think that's another huge conversation for so many women is getting in touch with those instincts, like learning to trust your own intuition and listening to your body and what it is actually telling you. Like we are just so trained to like drug and plug and do all these things to just like repress.
Yeah.
When I think those are very like magical powers that we were given and they've just been pathologized along the way. And it would be so great, you know, to help people get in touch with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Too. And there's the repair work. It's like, it's normal that I have this in me. It's actually vital to my sense of personal power and dignity and safety. And I can learn to use it in a way that's effective and is relational. Like I can be angry and grounded at the same time. I can be angry and I can be relational. And I think, you know, if there's been the experience where anger was only ever resulted in violence or rejection, right? Like that also becomes complicated. But to develop this new relational template, and again, a lot of this stuff can't just be done in isolation. It needs to be negotiated with other people. But to feel this new relational template where it's like, I can express this with you and I can still feel you here with me. Like I'm not too much. Right? You're not rejecting me. You're not retaliating against me. Right? And for your nervous system to really start to feel into that.
I read Nonviolent Communication, which was such a learning to be able to do that, you know, because I think we're also not given the tools on how to be grounded and angry and, you know, to like have those conversations and like you say, be comfortable in conflict. And that book, while it was short, it really did provide like a communication tool on how to express yourself without like aggravating who you're communicating with, without escalating it into like a yelling match.
Mm-hmm.
It was really about like, this is how I'm feeling, putting it back on yourself. This is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm thinking. This is what I need, rather than like, you're doing this and you're doing that. And just to be able to have like a conversation, it was so life changing for me. I was like, this book needs to be read by everybody, because that is how we're going to, change things, is to be able to have these conversations, especially when the world is so like divided on so many things right now. And, you're not allowed to have an opinion or not allowed to have any discourse around anything. To have those tools to be able to communicate in conflict is such, an imperative thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can feel the sort of connection to personal power as you stand in that middle place of like owning, like, this is what I need. This is what's happening for me, right? Because we can imagine it like a pendulum, as one swing of the pendulum is over here where it's, I was never allowed to have this. I'm not allowed to express it. I don't feel anger. I just collapse right into shame. The other swing of the pendulum is I have to stay in aggression all the time to keep myself safe. I need you to be small for me to feel safe, right? And neither of those are a grounded energy. And what you're talking about is, as I land in that middle place where it's like I can feel my anger and my healthy aggression, and I can stay connected to myself. I can keep my sense of self up out of shame, and I don't need to, attack or humiliate the other person. Right? That's where we grow. Like that's where wisdom starts to come in, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like so many unproductive arguments, like even with my husband and looking back, like I'll just be like triggering him nonstop in the attack, and then he's triggering me nonstop in the attack. And like after reading that book, I was like, wow, like this would be so much more productive. To be able to just like know how to communicate. And it seems so simple once he explains like how you just need to focus on yourself and what you're feeling rather than focusing on what the other person is not doing or doing. Then you can meet in that middle with respect. And
absolutely. Because our nervous systems are always talking to each other, right? Like even our words are talking, but like as you feel him escalate and you escalate, and then he feels you like your nervous systems are feeding and mirroring off the energy in each other. And so you're right. There is this practice of, if I can actually bring more grounding and regulation and rhythm into this interactions, then we could still have this feedback, but it could feed back in the direction of us both moving towards more safety and more and more connectedness.
Absolutely. Not triggering like the mother wounds and the father wounds. So next I have on our list of questions here is internalized anger. So many women struggle with internalizing their anger, leading to feelings of guilt or shame, which we've talked about. How can we begin to acknowledge and process this internalized anger in a healthy way?
Well, I mean, I think this ties into some of what we're sort of talking about is internalized anger actually shame, right? Is internalized anger that self-attack that can happen when we're in a shame state? And when we haven't been able to take a protective action, right? A threat's coming in. I take a protective action. My sense of self stays intact. A threat's coming in. I'm not able to, either because the threat is too big or I don't think I'm allowed to take protective action, right? Then the threat comes in and the attack goes into my sense of self. Then suddenly it's like, I'm mad at myself for not protecting myself. I'm mad at myself for letting this happen. I'm mad because I'm stupid. I'm mad because I always get things wrong. That I would suggest that internalized anger often is this collapse of shame that happens when we're not able to stand in that protective energy for ourselves. Right? And so this mobilizing of the nervous system up and out of that place, right? Through relationship, through connection, through setting limits, through making requests, right, is a really important part of shifting this, right? Back out of the collapse and back into some physical energy, some felt sense of like, this is mine and this is not mine, as opposed to, okay, it gets in and so it's all mine and I'm bad. And the other way I imagine internalized anger may be playing out is, I feel it, but I can't express it. And so then we're sort of looking at like passive aggressive, that sort of indirect simmering it's anger, but it feels kind of powerless. It's like the frustration. It's the, when I sit with clients who are wanting to vent, right? It's like, I want to vent. I'm like, but it's like the system's not resolving anything. It's like, I'm sort of firing in this little wheel of anger that feels unsatisfied, but I'm not getting any relief from it, right? I'm not getting any relief because I feel kind of powerless in this. Okay. And in that case, sometimes there's something that needs to happen. Sometimes there's also like, a grief process that needs to happen, a disappointment, a heartbreak, something else that also needs to be felt and integrated so the system can reorganize and be like, okay, what needs to happen next here? Right? Because if we can simmer, we can spend years in those sort of powerless places of resentment and frustration and not get a lot of resolution from that.
Well, that just reminds me so much, and from what even speaking with friends of mine, like in the workplace, like for me as a designer, if one more man mansplains logo design to me, I'm gonna like lose my shit. And that like with clients, I'm not in a position where I can express that, so then it does become something that I have to carry. And I think that happens a lot in the workplace. And there's that decorum of professionalism where you're not really allowed to like have those conversations and everybody's just supposed to not have emotions. And, yet that's a place that we have to spend so much time.
Absolutely. Well, and as I hear that, I would be curious, and I'm not going to, put you on the soft spot or analyze you right now, but I'd be curious what's happening inside you when you feel like I'm not allowed to actually set a limit in this client. Right? Like what's actually happening in that place that says like this client's mansplaining or, being condescending and there's something inside me that says I'm not actually allowed to like, okay, enough with this person. I would be curious about that process in you because there might be something really necessary about stepping into that place because otherwise there's this, and we won't use you specifically, but it's a really good general example, right? Otherwise there is sort of a trapped feeling of powerlessness, right? It keeps happening to me and I don't have access to power to push back and say or do what I wish I could.
Right? Yeah, because there's that feeling, like this is my client and the customer is always right and I can't, I don't want to tell them that way, but you're right. Like, why do I feel like I cannot put that boundary up? So it's interesting.
Is there a way to set a limit around that while still being relational? While still being like, I value you and I want to stay connected to you. And like, I'm going to use some voice here. I'm going to access the little bit of power that's necessary for us to stay meeting each other equally. So that I don't start to feel like I'm being bulldozed by you.
Yeah. And I guess it does go into like that feeling like I'm not allowed either as a woman or in the professional setting. So be willing to like give myself permission, I guess, to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is something certainly, when I do supervision, like with new therapists, this is something that comes up is like, I'm supposed to be caring for my clients. So I'm not allowed to kind of like call them out on behavior, like they no show or they don't pay me or,
right.
And what I would say is like, in some ways to actually address that behavior directly every time in a really loving relational way is good therapy, right? Like it is like, because here it is that we're negotiating. Okay, I feel bulldozed by you. And this might be a template that's very familiar in their life, right? It's like, I can't feel anyone here with me. And so it's like, when we actually set these limits in these relationships, it's like, hey, I want to stay connected to you. I value this. Here's what my policy is. And I hope we can connect again. It's like, we actually become that steady model of, right? It's like I can express limits and be self-protective and honor my own dignity and still stay connected to you. Because I think that's what was missing for a lot of people who have a complicated relationship with anger, where it's like either it escalates to aggression or it escalates to rejection. And so
how would you like for women, like for me, example, like how would you get used to that? Like without trying to like practice with it, how do you start to
what I would offer just as a general suggestion is like get familiar with using voice. Like start to notice what your relationship with using voice is. Like when you have to make requests of things, when you have to express a preference of things, when you have to disagree with someone. Something really powerful that can happen is if we just in mindfulness, like say the word no. inside us a few times, because for a lot of women, that's actually very stirring. Like
Mm.
just to feel like a clear, calm no come through over and over, that can actually bump into a lot of things inside us. So
Hmm.
in some ways it is, it is this rebuilding of a relationship is can I use voice? Can I access voice and trust that it's there? Can I use it? And ideally what also can happen is, can I use it in spaces where I'm not going to be punished or rejected for using it? This is where I think therapy can be really helpful, or women's groups or safe spaces where we can get a template of what it feels like to use voice and not be punished for that. Right. So that
Hmm.
when we go out into the world with people who like don't always have our best interests at heart, and we use voice and they have a negative reaction, our system doesn't fragment so much, because we have a feeling of like, okay, like, I know I'm allowed to do this. It didn't work here, but I have a felt sense that I'm not bad for doing this.
Hmm.
Not bad for needing or wanting something different from this person.
Yeah, it's so interesting how entrenched that is, hey, for women to be able to express that
Yeah,
in the
absolutely.
place or anywhere. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I think stigma is still really there. I think, I would say women, and I imagine this is doubly true, like for women of color, there is more negative reaction, more stigma, more rejection, whether it's conscious or unconscious, because of these deep, deep sort of societal beliefs that we
Hmm.
collectively have internalized.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that intersectionality and anger? Like, how does race, class, sexuality, and other intersecting identities influence the way women experience and express anger?
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't see myself as an expert on that, but I would say, we've been talking about this idea that, when we deny people access to their anger and healthy aggression, when we shame people for feeling anger or accessing healthy aggression, we deny them equal access to power in some sense. And
Hmm.
so we've been talking about the way that happens with women as a collective, but we can very quickly stretch into the way that this also happens with racialized communities. For example, I'm thinking of like Black and Indigenous communities, the way this plays out in the psychiatric system, in the child protection system, in the criminal
Mm.
justice system, like the way that those attempts to self-protect are then doubled back and used against an individual in these systems, right? And how
Hmm.
traumatic and devastating that is. Right? So I think we do very much still have imbalances in terms of who is allowed to access anger and healthy aggression, right? What form it's allowed to take, when it's acceptable and when it's too much, right? And
Hmm.
I think these often come down the lines of sort of European values, right? Middle
Hmm.
class European values. Um,
Yeah, in that Rage Becomes Her book, there was a quote that stood out, and it said, "A society that I don't have it written down, but a society that does not uh, respect women's anger is a society that does not respect women," or
yeah,
something to that effect.
yeah.
And it was like, yeah, because they don't have the equal ability to access power,
Mhm.
so that it is like a system of oppression.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In this case, these relational experiences that happen often, in our family of origin, in our classrooms, in our current relationships, these moment to moment relational experiences sort of happen collectively over and over and over again. And then we develop this belief around, what does it mean about me if I feel this, right? We have to actually fragment off from a whole part of who we are in some ways. We have to split ourselves off from a piece of who we are in order to belong, which always has a devastating impact on our well-being in a bigger sense.
Hmm. And even looking at sort of like universal laws maybe, but like the idea of like you can't have stars without the night. It's you need both the dark and the light to be able to experience the other. So to completely deny your sort of anger and dark side, if you want to call it that, like then it also sort of paralyzes your ability to feel the other side as well.
Absolutely. That's been my experience is often when anger is dissociated, is those are the folks who have the most complicated relationship with anger.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Who either acted out in these very sort of sideways, passive aggressive ways that are not effective, who relegate it to the realm of shame. And a lot of what lives in the realm of shame also lives in secrecy. So there's behaviors that come out in secrecy, right? Whether that's, substance use or, compulsive behaviors or things that then live in the shadows of secrecy, and anger lives there too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a lot to be said about cultivating a healthy relationship with this, about at the very least letting it exist in you, acknowledging that it exists and letting it exist, even if you don't quite know what to do with it or how to use it skillfully.
Mm-hmm. And that would be probably more typical of women to just take on and hold, like even other people's anger, not even their own.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we tend to also become, a bit complacent to how much we're actually carrying. So, you don't know how bad you feel until you start to feel good again. And I think quite often we're all walking around with this, just weight of unexpressed emotion. Yeah, that would be really great.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, I think not sticking up for ourselves, right? Not sticking up for ourselves, not saying what's true, not being able to negotiate the terms and boundaries of a relationship, not being able to disagree, right? Not being able to, vocalize these things, that takes a toll on us after a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to override all those instincts in your system, you can do it, but living with chronic shame, that starts to take a toll on our systems in a really profound way. And I think that's often what brings people into counseling is like, this doesn't feel this way, this template of how I learned to survive and made sense isn't making sense anymore. It's taking a toll on me. It's taking a toll on my ability to have satisfying relationships, my ability to regulate my own emotions, my sense of self, whatever that be, my body, I'm exhausted all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you say, why doesn't everybody go to counseling? No.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Because it's intimidating, because because it's uncomfortable, because it can be really hard at times, because counseling is kind of like dating, and sometimes you have to go through a few people to find the right fit, and it can be really discouraging to have bad experiences. Yeah, I think there's lots of valid reasons people don't go.
Yeah, for sure.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any resources or books or things for people who don't want to go to counseling or haven't found the perfect fit? Or
Yeah. Well, you've been talking about, you said Rage Becomes Her?
Mm-hmm.
Which sounds like a wonderful resource. And there's a really old, I feel like it's probably like early 90s maybe, but The Dance of Anger. And that's about women's relationship with anger as well. And, even though it's like 30 years old, it's still very relatable in terms of like often what happens in our family systems, these existing gender inequalities, the way that, if we're not allowed to use anger directly, we have to navigate safety in these indirect ways. Right. So I think that's sort of a classic in that sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then what about circling back to the idea of wise woman archetypes in concept of anger? How might you make connections there?
I mean, if I were to work with that with someone, what I might imagine is two things. And one is, how do you imagine that she would respond to this situation? Say there was something, it's like there's something in that moment, something happened, it was painful, I felt anger. There's something I wished I could do, but it felt like I couldn't at the time. And it's like, how would she respond? Right. We might bring in that, this supportive figure who's there with you. How would she respond? Right. Or if you responded in a way and suddenly there's shame there, right? It's like, and what does she want you to know about your anger, right? Like, is there a way we can actually use these wise women to have some, I talk about how much of this work with anger and shame is relational. It's a hurt that happened in relationship. We repair it in relationship. And so this can be a relational figure that we carry with us in some ways to be a good template of how to reassure and be kind to ourselves. Right. I mean, we could also look at, if we want to embody the feeling of what it might mean to use voice or to have protective energy in our body, we might feel drawn to certain archetypes who seem to already have a lot of access to that. Right. It's like, who's the figure? How do you imagine it feels to inhabit her body? Right. Like, how do you imagine her voice comes out and feels when it moves through her vocal cords? Right. Like, so there's all kinds of ways that we could certainly play with this, but yeah, I think those are a few examples that come to mind.
I just started reading for the second time is Awakening Shakti. And it's got, like some of those goddesses are dark and like very
Totally.
crazy, like Kali, and
Totally.
it's been great to sort of see that and connect, and to be able to sort of access that.
I think you and I were talking about Sharon Blackie and Hagitude and that idea. Yes. She draws in a lot of mythological older women and angry women and women who are truth tellers and women who are, she talks about Baba Yaga, the sort of like, she can be ruthless, but it's in the interest of good, right? Like I think if that's a source of inspiration, if we can read these stories and find pieces of our experience and also get a new a new template of how to make meaning out of some of these things, right? If the old template is like, I'm too much or I'm bad or I'm a bitch. And it's like, is there a new template of how to make meaning of this energy that's moving inside you and why it exists and how it's being used? I think, stories can be a way to help dive into that and reimagine that a little bit.
Yeah. I loved in the beginning of Hagitude, and she spoke about how, we sort of have this event as an entry into maidenhood. You get your period, and then you have a baby as your entry point into motherhood. But there is no like significant event into like the old crone or the wise woman, and that all the stories typically surround like this, like gnarly old lady in the woods. Like there's not really any great, well, I shouldn't say great, but like most of the stories are that way. And so it's, it's almost like up to us to sort of rewrite those stories and to, like bring mythology and archetypes in to sort of embody them into back into existence. So being allowed to be angry and beautiful, or angry and,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think of each of those junctions as like, there is a relationship with anger. It's just a different one, right? It's like, I think of the maiden as what we see as like that youth anger. We see we're right now in a state of like students protesting around the world. It's like, there's something about that youth that has that like fearlessness, that willing to like, I'm going to stand up for what's right. I don't care about like I'm that willingness to run right head on into justice.
Yeah.
Right. And that takes a form. And then the energy of the mother or the creatrix or however we conceptualize it is like, it might be a more protective energy. It might be more of like, it might not be that huge output of the youth, of the maiden, but it's like this protective energy. And so, and it's like, okay, and then what's the crone's relationship with this? Right? So we can imagine that if we didn't disavow anger, that it would have played an important role in each of these phases of the cycle, and it evolves and it takes different forms as it becomes more sophisticated through our process of gathering wisdom and through life experience.
And I do find, like I'd mentioned, like coming into perimenopause, like the anger is definitely there, but I'm less afraid to express it, like in many situations. Yeah, where I'd like tell somebody off when I wouldn't normally, and then I'll get off the phone and I'll be like, who is that? Like, where did that
It's like, who's this truth teller in me, right? Like,
It's just like, coming out.
And it's like, I'm as I'm listening, I'm like, it sounds like it's a little uncomfortable, but also like a little bit awesome and empowering. Yeah. You're like inhabiting this new relationship with your anger a little bit. And this,
and just like no tolerance, like if you're going to mansplain me, we're done. Like, see you later. And tell you
there it is, right? And just feel that. It's like, we're done, right? And feel how that's not actually attacking. That's actually like, feel that. That's what I mean by healthy aggression, right? Okay, like we're done. Like it doesn't have to be this big thing that we think it is.
Yeah.
This space inside us that's like, no closer, right?
And I think that does come also from, like embodying, for me now, it feels like because I do feel safe on my own, I do feel okay where I'm at, that I feel like I'm okay to express that because I don't need you, like I'm not
Mm-hmm.
afraid to lose a client or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the more we have access to trust that we can take care of ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
sense with support, because we all need support, but the more we have a felt sense that, I can take care of myself, I think often the safer it is to inhabit anger. Right. And so, we talk about why it's so hard for children, why often these templates that we carry set root in us in childhood is because children are dependent, right? And so it often is this like, I have to learn that I'm okay and I can say no and I can take care of myself and I'll survive the consequences of this. Even if my little kid body couldn't, my adult body actually knows that I'll still be safe and okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just thinking back to what you were saying about anger and maidenhood, and even in motherhood, like I remember thinking there were times where I'm like, where did that girl go? Because she was so opinionated and so like you said, like just drive headstrong into, a protest or whatever it might be, just was there. And I remember like missing her and being like, wow, where is that?
Yeah.
But you can definitely feel now, like she's coming back,
yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So it must be, like that cyclical now coming into sort of the wise woman era that.
Totally. I love my early 20s self. She was such a badass. She was like, yeah, just like a feminist punk, showing up for everything, like fearless, not super rooted in what I believed yet. It's like I hadn't really deeply embodied it. I knew what I thought was right, but it wasn't in my bones yet at that point. And I couldn't handle being challenged as well as I can now. Right. But there was so much energy there.
Yeah.
Right? And then I remember the shift when it was like, oh, this way of being is getting a little exhausting. Right. And as I get older, I'm understanding that there's complexity beyond right and wrong, good and bad. And I'm imagining ways of these same values coming through in maybe a quieter but a more sustainable and grounded way. Right. I remember that distinction very much, but I sometimes still wish like I could access her energy.
Yeah.
And her like, I don't know, just passion about everything, right?
Yeah. But I think that does come with the wise woman is just coming into that and like you said, embodying it and being more grounded in it and also recognizing like, that I can change these things, in myself. I don't know what I'm specifically referring to, but other people are going to come to their comeuppance when they do, and I don't have to like rage out against them. They'll figure it out on their own time, and I can resolve what I can resolve here.
Absolutely. I remember I was when I was doing my bachelor's in social work, there was the director of School of Social Work was an African Nova Scotian woman named Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard. I think she went on to be a Canadian senator at some point, but I remember her, and I mean, here's this woman who lived the realities of racism her whole life, right? And she's talking to us, these sort of idealistic social work students, and she's like, there was a point where I learned in my activism that you don't change people by bopping them on the head, right? All you teach them is not to say certain things around you so they don't get bopped on the head. But she's like, you change people by like engaging in deep relational conversation, by engaging in deep humanity with people, by, inviting into connection, by holding steady in what you believe, by grounding into your anger. I mean, I'm probably not, her words were probably much more brilliant than I'm paraphrasing this like 18 years later, but that made it, I just pulled my headphones out there. Sorry about that. But that made an impact on me, right? I was just like, wow, okay. Like she had that very like archetypal wise woman energy. And I was like, okay, maybe she's on to something here because the route I'm going feels intense, but it feels like I'm fighting everyone all the time. Right? Yeah. So how do I cultivate a relationship with it after not having access to anger for so many years? It felt really good to be fighting everyone all the time. Right? But then it was like, okay, so that healing needed to happen. And now it's like, how do I root this into something else?
Just going back to what you were saying as well, there's a quote that always really stuck with me, and it's Mother Teresa. And she says, if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. So like you don't necessarily have to be out activating and angry, and we can do it in very close relationship. And
I would suggest that might be where the most meaningful change happens, where it's like, I can be in connection with you, and then I can actually set limit with you and use some healthy aggression if I need to. And no one gets hurt or humiliated in that. Right. And we can stay in connection. Like, that's a profoundly healing process to go through for so many of us who either had our anger shamed or who had our anger like doubled down on with even more aggression. Right. Like, to stay in that place of like, I'm setting a limit with you and I'm staying connected with you, with the people that we love. I mean, there's people out in the world where it's like, I need to just set a limit with you and, we never have contact again. Right. But where it's, I think it's most complicated when it's like, I want to say no to what's happening right now, but I want to say yes to staying in connection with you. That's often where people get really stuck on how to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah. The only thing I think I would add to that is like, what I often will say to folks that I'm working with, if there's, again, trying to gain a little bit of access to a relationship with anger, is to use your physicality, right? Like, use your physicality. And, we're all living in different bodies. So what I say is like, use your physicality to the highest intensity that your body, can comfortably tolerate. But there's something, it's funny. I was actually like out chopping wood as I was thinking about that. I was preparing for this interview and I was sort of thinking about what we might talk about in chopping wood. And I was like, oh, but the remember of like, it actually feels very satisfying to remember that it's like, I'm in an adult body that can take action, that can move. I can feel my muscles engaging. I can feel my legs or my core engaging, like to actually feel how strong you are, right? Like, feel how strong you are in a really physical way. Right? To trust that your body, your body's there to support and protect you. Right. And we can go to the extremes and say, of course, that won't always be possible, but to have a felt sense of that on a day-to-day basis, I think is very important, to come out of that collapse state that shame will trap a lot of people, a lot of women in. Well, that would be one, if we're sitting in anger, that's that powerless anger, that's not getting a sense of resolution. Often there is like a high intensity of physicality that needs to move there. It's like from powerless to feeling some sense of effective action. So I would just add that sort of somatic layer in.
Yes, because what they say, emotion is like just energy in motion, and it like just needs to move out. Like, I started running last year. I injured my ankle and I haven't been able to. But that was like, to feel my heart pumping and like to be out in like the woods and the trails. It was just like, you'd feel powerful and the energy would be moving out. And it was the best thing to unscramble my brain I've ever experienced.
Absolutely. Great. Absolutely. That sense of like, feel how strong you are. Like, feel how, if something went down right now, feel how strong your legs are, right? Like, just notice that, like really deeply root into that. Like, feel the sense that, you've got that in you, right? And so that can be an important piece. And again, I know this is complex because again, we're all in different bodies, but if some level of physicality is available, I think it's so valuable if you've had a kind of a collapsed or timid or powerless relationship with anger and healthy aggression.
Yeah. Everybody needs to get exercising. It's so powerful, like movement as medicine. I'm a huge proponent.
Yeah, me too.
Is there anything you'd like to add to this conversation?
No, I don't think so. I feel like we covered a lot of terrain.
Yeah, it was very, very informative. I'm going to sit with it for a while for sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time. It is 1, so